We all saw the headline, right? The $250 million number.
Oh, yeah.
The one tied to that infamous feeding our future scandal in Minnesota.
It was everywhere.
Exactly. Money that was supposed to go to hungry kids, and instead it's buying luxury homes, fast cars, jewelry. It looked like a pretty clear-cut case.
It did. Horrifying greed, a total betrayal. It was a national embarrassment.
It was.
But we have to reset that number for you. That $250 million, as horrifying as it is, was really only the single most visible surface peak of the mountain.
Just the tip of the iceberg.
Precisely. What federal investigators have now confirmed is that they're dealing with a coordinated financial tidal wave, a systemic billion-dollar ecosystem of integrated schemes.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. And it's been strategically bleeding the American taxpayer dry for years. This isn't just a local corruption problem. This is, industrial-scale, sophisticated financial warfare against our own programs.
$1 billion. Just try to wrap your head around that scale for a second. While millions of Americans were struggling during the pandemic, worrying about how to put food on their own tables, these criminal networks were setting up fake daycare centers, inventing children, and submitting these complex, detailed bills to the government for services that never, ever happened.
They weren't just exploiting the programs?
No, they were dismantling them for profit. It's so calculated. It's a catastrophic betrayal.
And okay, here's the crucial pivot. This is the insight that really elevates this whole discussion from just a massive financial crime to an immediate threat to your safety.
Okay.
For days, the whole focus was just on the theft. But then federal agencies, including these specialized financial intelligence units, they started tracking where the stolen money went, not just here, but across borders. And they discovered a highly disturbing money trail, one that connected the Twin Cities to international risks.
Wait, you mean like overseas transfers? I'm assuming to, standard tax havens, that kind of thing.
Not just tax havens. See, the funds weren't just vanishing into some random offshore accounts in the Caymans.
Right.
They were clustering. They were clustering in specific high-risk regions, areas known to be volatile, often controlled, or, heavily influenced by extremist groups. Organizations overtly hostile to the United States.
No way.
So that confirms it. The days of calling the Minnesota fraud just theft, they're over. When welfare fraud starts funding instability abroad, it transforms this systemic financial failure into a direct compromise of American national security.
So our tax dollars, the exact money meant to help the most vulnerable Americans, was unknowingly funneled into a pipeline that could potentially support global security threats. All because state oversight just completely failed.
That's the terrifying reality of it.
That is terrifying. Okay, let's unpack this. Stay with us as we expose the full truth about the Minnesota pipeline right here on The Deep Dive.
So where do you even begin with something this massive?
Let's jump straight into the bizarre circumstances that ultimately detonated this whole billion-dollar operation. Because if it was this coordinated, this widespread, you'd think, a massive multi-year FBI audit would be what brought it down.
Right. You'd expect some whistleblower with a spreadsheet.
Exactly. But that's not what happened here.
Not at all. The spark that lit the entire powder keg wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a local, street-level criminal bust hundreds of miles away.
In Maine, of all places.
In Maine, it was the arrest of a local official, a Somali city councilor named Ilhan Osman. And this arrest, which at first was just for gun theft and drug connections, it became the single collision point that exposed the entire nationwide financial fraud structure.
Okay, wait, hold on. This sounds like classic confirmation bias or just a wild conspiracy theory. You have a local politician in Maine. He's arrested on gun charges, potentially tied to a condemned drug house. How does that isolated incident, how does it instantly detonate a massive, complex federal fraud probe centered in Minnesota? That link feels incredibly tenuous. What tangible evidence, beyond just similar surnames, what actually convinced federal agents they were dealing with a single, coordinated system?
And that's the brilliant part of the investigative analysis. So Osman was indicted on federal gun theft charges, and he was tied directly to a condemned drug house. Federal agents seized not just firearms, but significant amounts of meth, fentanyl, and cocaine.
So serious organized crime.
Highly serious, street-level organized crime. But here is the critical collision point. Osman's name and the names of specific people associated with him, his family, his business partners, They were already flagged.
Flagged where?
On the watch lists of federal agencies that were preparing new fraud indictments for these massive Somali-linked networks operating back in Minnesota.
So the intelligence agents, they already had these lists of high-priority targets for a huge financial scam, and then suddenly one of those names just pops up in a completely different criminal context, drugs and guns in another state.
Exactly. It provided the physical linkage they needed. They realized they weren't dealing with two separate criminal problems: a vast fraud ring in Minnesota and a drug and gun network in Maine. They were dealing with two heavily armed, financially fueled arms of the same octopus.
They were feeding the same infrastructure.
Precisely. Analysts rapidly started cross-referencing everything, overlapping surnames, shell corporations, similar community organizations, and critically, the exact same informal money transfer routes that were being used by the financial fraudsters.
So the gun charge in Maine didn't just expose Osman, it provided a geographical bridge. It proved the Minnesota operation wasn't localized, it was interstate, and it was leveraging an already established criminal network.
The pattern became undeniable. They started cross-referencing activity in other states where they suspected similar networks were operating: Ohio, Washington, Colorado, Texas.
Man.
The same fingerprints kept showing up, the same shell company structures, the same names, the same money laundering methods. A DHS official later confirmed that the overlap was, and I'm quoting, statistically impossible to be accidental. For years, they had successfully hidden in plain sight. They were using state lines and this geographical distribution to, dilute the concentration of suspicious activity. It made it all look like a series of small, unconnected, local corruption issues.
And that one politician's arrest for non-financial crimes, drugs and guns, it just rips the cover off the entire thing. It confirms it was a coordinated nationwide system. I mean, the sheer complexity of that coordination is just terrifying.
Well, what's truly fascinating here is the sophistication of the criminal networks versus, the state's oversight.
That's a total mismatch.
A total mismatch. The criminals understood the decentralized nature of the funding, how to leverage geography and separate state bureaucracies, far better than the government bodies that were supposed to be monitoring the aid programs. Their ability to pivot so quickly from their financial core in Minneapolis to the logistical and physical crime connections in Maine proved they were operating at a high, almost industrial level.
They treated welfare programs not as, assistance for people in need, but as a resource to be mined by a well-organized criminal syndicate.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it.
So let's move past the shock of that initial arrest to the terrifying scale of the financial damage. We're moving beyond the $250 million feeding our future case now to the entire ecosystem that federal auditors now believe laundered billions.
Billions with a B.
To really get this, we need to dive into the technical details. I mean, how exactly did they exploit the system across so many different verticals all at the same time?
The key to that billion-dollar scale is the diversity of the schemes. They systematically targeted every single state-administered funding silo. So we have to, define the specific acronyms and programs they abused, because those are the tools the criminals actually used.
Okay, give us the breakdown. Which programs were the most vulnerable?
Well, we're talking about SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Right.
Most people know it as food stamps. They also targeted medical assistance, or MA, funds, housing stabilization aid, and of course the various childcare and food distribution programs that spiked during the pandemic.
And all of these are administered locally.
Exactly, which creates these inherent gaps in information sharing between the state departments. And the fraudsters, they exploited those gaps to perfection.
So let's start with the non-food schemes. How do you successfully fake something as complex as billing for autism services? I mean, that requires specific medical knowledge, doesn't it?
It requires specific medical codes, yes, but not necessarily actual medical professionals. See, autism service billing fraud is insidious precisely because it targets these highly specific, very expensive behavioral therapy sessions.
So what would they do?
The network would establish these sophisticated shell companies that operated as therapy providers or, nonprofits offering specialized services. They'd then submit these detailed high-cost claims, often under the state's medical assistance program, for intense therapy sessions that never happened.
And they just use the fabricated identities that they created elsewhere in the network to act as the patients.
Exactly. Since the state bureaucracy is so heavily focused on processing complex medical claims quickly, especially for children's services, the verification of whether the sessions even took place or if the patient was real or eligible it was minimal.
They weaponized the state's bureaucracy against itself.
They did. They maximized profit by targeting the high reimbursement services and exploiting the state's processing speed over its due diligence. They essentially created a paper factory that just printed money using fake patient records.
So they leveraged the state's desire to help vulnerable people, in this case, kids with autism, as the perfect moral cover for massive financial theft. That is just pure cynicism.
And it was just one lane of traffic for them. I mean, look at housing stabilization fraud. This scheme involves systematically creating fabricated rental leases or property ownership claims or residency claims to access emergency state funds.
Funds meant to prevent homelessness.
Precisely. Funds designed to prevent homelessness or stabilize housing during economic crises.
So they weren't actually renting properties, they were renting identities to claim the funds.
Correct. The money, which was supposed to go to legitimate landlords or property managers, was instead being routed to shell corporations that were controlled by the fraud ring. They'd claim they were receiving massive rental assistance payments, often using these vastly inflated rates for non-existent tenants, or tenants using fake identities. It created a stable revenue stream disguised as housing aid.
And the most visible scheme, the one that got all the headlines, the phantom children in the daycare centers. How do they scale that up to industrial levels?
That's the child care and food distribution fraud rings. Centers would register hundreds, sometimes thousands, of phantom children. They would then bill the state daily for meals, for care, for enrichment services, all using the official state reimbursement rates.
And no one checked.
Well, they understood that the state auditors were critically understaffed. They relied heavily on the honor system and self-reported attendance records, particularly when pandemic restrictions made physical inspections rare or, just difficult. If a center claimed to feed 1,000 kids a day, the state had no reliable real-time way to verify that count.
So the system was basically designed on a foundation of trust.
Inherent trust, yeah.
And these criminal enterprises immediately and completely violated that trust across multiple departments. Now, we have to talk about how they move the cash. You mentioned shell nonprofits and these clan-based informal economies. What exactly does that phrase, clan-based informal economies, mean for the average listener?
It's the mechanism they use to launder and transport the massive amounts of stolen funds without triggering the traditional U.S. banking alarms.
Yep.
The shell nonprofits were crucial for that first step. They provided the veneer of legitimacy. They looked like charitable organizations distributing aid, capable of receiving large government checks. Internally, though, these nonprofits just served as giant collection points, funneling millions of dollars into that informal money transfer system.
And this informal system, it just bypasses the standard scrutiny.
Yes. A clan-based informal economy refers to non-Western, often trust-based money transfer systems. Sometimes people refer to them by the generic term hawala or zawala.
How does that work?
Instead of using a slow, traceable wire transfer that just screams suspicious activity to a federal bank auditor, they use trusted intermediaries. A person in Minnesota hands cash to a local intermediary, who then contacts their counterpart overseas, and they ensure the equivalent value minus a small fee is delivered to family or associates in a foreign country, often within hours.
And with no real paper trail.
Frequently without a traditional auditable paper trail.
So this allows the money to just jump jurisdictions and financial systems instantly, making it incredibly difficult for federal agents to trace it back to the original source of the fraud.
Exactly. The key insight here is that the fraud was not sloppy. It was intentionally structured. It used these highly strategic, non-transparent mechanisms specifically to evade state and federal oversight. This proves it was a sophisticated operation years in the making.
Which brings us to the failure of that oversight. I mean, if this was years in the making and this strategic, how on earth did state leaders allow this industrial-scale theft to continue for so long?
This is the political sickness at the heart of the crisis. According to the federal briefings, state leaders were either completely asleep at the wheel due to just gross incompetence, or, and this is far more dangerous, they were too scared of political backlash to shut the thing down. This wasn't a minor clerical error that was missed. This was an organized, deliberate operation that grew so fast and so out of control that even the investigators were stunned. The network knew they could operate with impunity because the political system was unwilling to apply scrutiny to programs that were deemed too sensitive to question.
So they were prioritizing optics over their fiduciary responsibility.
That's right.
Size. They allowed the politics of compassion to completely override the duty of governance. They knew the risk, But the political cost of stopping the fraud, the backlash from activist groups or certain constituents, was apparently higher than the cost of billions of taxpayer dollars being stolen.
And that failure leads directly to the core question.
Yeah.
Why does a nonprofit taking money in Minnesota affect a listener in, say, Arizona? Because this is the ultimate massive expression of systemic cost transfer.
Okay, I need that connection made explicit. When I'm standing in the checkout line and my grocery bill is shocking, what am I specifically paying for that's related to this?
You are paying the price for the failure to police the system. Think about the direct, practical impact of billions in fraudulent claims. 1. Illegal benefits mean artificial demand and inflation in the housing sector. That drives up rent and housing costs for everyone struggling to afford a home.
Okay.
2. Fraudulent S&AP rolls create massive systemic inventory loss for grocery chains. They don't absorb that loss. They pass it on to every consumer in the form of higher prices. That, 20% surge you see at the checkout line. A measurable part of that cost is literally covering the fraudulent losses incurred by criminal enterprises exploiting the system.
So my inability to afford eggs or milk isn't just about some abstract inflation. It's a direct, measurable consequence of a political failure hundreds of miles away that allowed criminal networks to exploit multiple benefit programs at the same time.
Precisely. And 3, overloaded hospitals. They're dealing with fabricated claims and unnecessary strains on medical benefits, which means resources are drained from the system. This results in longer waits, higher premiums, and fewer services for legitimate, law-abiding citizens who have paid into the system their entire lives.
So this scandal is a symptom.
It's a symptom of a systemic sickness where the political failure to police the fraud means you, the listener, you foot the bill for the criminals' luxury cars.
That clarity is absolutely vital. It shifts this from being just some regional political scandal to a national economic and affordability threat, which now forces us to confront the terrifying transition, the fusion of this domestic theft with international national security concerns.
This is the point where the investigation moved beyond the FBI and the financial intelligence units and mobilized specialized national security agencies like Homeland Security and ICE.
Right.
Federal investigators were no longer just pursuing the money. They were tracking its flow overseas through remittance data.
We established they were looking for suspicious clustering. How did they actually define that clustering?
Well, they focused on transactions that showed several high-risk characteristics. Things like abnormally high volume or frequency, routing through informal or unregistered transfer agents, and critically, final convergence points near or within regions under the operational control of flagged foreign entities.
So these trails, which originated from the shell corporations and the Minnesota fraud rings,
Right.
they converged in regions that are considered significant operational hotspots for extremist groups.
That is the so what implication? I mean, if even a fraction of the billions in stolen welfare money taxpayer dollars meant for the most vulnerable, if even a fraction of that ended up supporting or funding extremist activity abroad, whether it was intentional or not,
It doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter. The failure of state oversight in Minnesota became a catastrophic national security failure. The state ceased being just a local political debate. It became part of a global security conversation directly linked to foreign instability.
And this documented risk is exactly why the political hypocrisy and the public lack of concern from specific leaders is so outrageous. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, whose district is basically ground zero for this entire operation, was reported to have simply smirked and laughed, refusing to acknowledge the magnitude of the billions lost.
Her dismissiveness was a political tactic, but you're right. It poured gasoline on the fire of outrage. She chose to ignore the billions siphoned away and the documented national security concerns. Instead, she deflected. She argued the fraud was caused by program design flaws of pandemic aid.
So she blamed the complexity of the system, not the organized criminal networks that spent years intentionally exploiting those flaws.
Right. She essentially said the system was too complicated, not that criminals were robbing it blind.
She tried to frame this documented enormous financial crime as an identity-based conflict, a targeted attack, rather than addressing the core issue of systemic fraud and these money trails linking back to her own district.
Exactly. And that political refusal to separate the criminal elements from the law-abiding community, that ignited the next stage of the national firestorm. It led directly to the enforcement hammer that was dropped by the Trump administration.
Let's talk about that enforcement hammer and the immediate, powerful backlash it provoked. Trump basically fused immigration enforcement, fraud exposure, and national security into one single mission set. It changed the game completely.
The response was surgical, not symbolic. President Trump authorized a major ICE surge, a full-scale, boots-on-the-ground operation across Minnesota, and this was targeted specifically at individuals who were flagged by the financial intelligence units.
So the people tied directly to the fraud network.
The ones tied to the fraud network
Yeah.
involved in fraudulent visas, sham marriages, sham childcare networks, and proven money laundering.
So this wasn't a random sweep of communities. This was highly targeted. It was based on cross-referenced financial transfers, overlapping shell corporation ownership, and documented identities that were compiled by federal agencies ever since that initial arrest in Maine. The precision of that sweep must have terrified the political establishment.
It confirmed the government knew exactly where to look and who to question. And this targeted operation was immediately followed by a significant policy reversal. The termination of TPS, or temporary protected status, for Somali nationals, citing the widespread exploitation of the program.
Okay, we need to define TPS thoroughly. What is that status, and why was its termination, even for those accused of fraud, such a political shockwave?
So, temporary protected status, TPS, is an immigration status granted to nationals of countries who can't return home safely, due to active armed conflict, natural disasters, other serious, extraordinary conditions. It gives beneficiaries temporary protection from deportation and allows them to get work authorization.
And law enforcement's argument was?
Law enforcement argued that federal investigators had uncovered widespread, systematic exploitation of this protection.
Specifically, how is it exploited within the fraud network?
We're talking about duplicated identities, fraudulent asylum claims that enabled access to benefits, and individuals allegedly using their TPS-protected status while simultaneously running these vast domestic fraud schemes and funneling stolen money abroad.
So the government argued that the TPS shield itself was being used to facilitate organized crime. It was giving criminal elements legal cover to stay in the country while operating their schemes.
That's right. So the legal logic of the Trump administration wasn't framed as, broad anti-immigration policy. It was framed as necessary policy termination to eliminate a legal loophole that was actively enabling the largest welfare fraud in U.S. history.
The administration argued that the shield itself had become an enabling factor for the criminals.
Exactly. And the termination instantly changed the legal landscape. Thousands who relied on those protections now faced new scrutiny, new background checks, and in some cases, immediate deportation proceedings because their protected status was now inextricably linked to a network under federal investigation.
And the activist groups, of course, they framed it entirely as Trump criminalizing immigrants. They completely ignored the fact that prosecutors were unraveling the systematic theft of billions of dollars.
Well, the chaos that ensued, the protests and the intense media backlash, it was strategic.
Yeah.
It served to deflect attention away from the core issue of the documented fraud, the systemic failure, and the national security implications of those money trails.
And the enforcement actions kept coming, which brings us to the visa collapse bombshell. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem dropped a truly staggering figure. She claimed that 50% of all Minnesota visa applications showed signs of fraud. 50%.
1 out of every 2.
1 out of every 2.
That figure, it initially sounds impossible. And yet, federal agencies began to confirm widespread systemic patterns that supported that high volume of fraud. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, industrialized pipeline, a conveyor belt of fraudulent entries designed to maximize access to U.S. benefits and citizenship.
What kind of fraud are we talking about here?
We're talking about sham marriages used to obtain legal status, manufactured identities used to access SNAP and medical assistance, and applicants claiming kinship to people who were not only unrelated, but sometimes not even in the same hemisphere.
So every fraudulent visa created another fully documented access point into those government programs.
Yes.
Programs that were supposed to be for struggling American families, not organized criminal enterprises.
And this is where we deliver the critical long-term consequence for you, the listener. If federal agencies have confirmed that half of a regional application pipeline is compromised, you must expect drastic long-term overhauls to visa and asylum processing nationwide.
So it affects everyone.
Everyone, every legitimate applicant, every hardworking individual trying to immigrate lawfully will now face intense new scrutiny, massive delays, and far higher hurdles, all because of the failure to police the system earlier. The criminal exploitation hurts not only the American taxpayer, but also the legitimate immigrant who is waiting patiently in line.
The fallout is long-term and systemic. It's created a regulatory crisis that's going to affect millions. Now let's talk about the resistance within Minneapolis itself. the constitutional firestorm that erupted locally against federal authority.
This is one of the most alarming manifestations of that sanctuary city ideology. The Minneapolis police chief stepped forward and did something unprecedented. He instructed residents that if they saw federal agents, DHS or ICE, performing lawful enforcement under federal warrants, they should call 911.
Provocation. He suggested local police officers might intervene against federal agents? I mean, that's not community support. That's the city government actively trying to undermine federal law enforcement and obstruct an active investigation that's linked to national security.
It signals a growing, dangerous rebellion inside these sanctuary cities. Local officials, prioritizing a specific political narrative over their legal obligations, are willing to instruct local law enforcement to obstruct active federal investigations. That statement didn't cool down the crisis, it deliberately escalated it. It raised critical legal, jurisdictional, and safety concerns.
I mean, what happens when local police and federal agents, both fully armed and acting under different mandates, collide over the same suspect in the same neighborhood?
That situation creates chaos and potential danger for everyone involved. The conflict over jurisdiction and priority enforcement objectives becomes a constitutional showdown. It forces Americans to confront how far a local government is willing to go to shield individuals who are implicated in massive fraud schemes, even when the financial trails lead directly to concerns about international security.
It gives high-value targets political cover and time to flee or destroy evidence.
Exactly.
And if we look at why the local political class might be so frantic to obstruct these investigations, we reach the final damning piece of evidence, the corruption trail sitting right there in the campaign finance reports.
This is the part that proves the corruption wasn't just hidden in shell nonprofits. It was integrated into the highest political levels in Minnesota. Federal filings revealed that multiple Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota took tens of thousands of dollars in campaign donations.
And those donations came directly from key individuals who are now charged in the Feeding Our Future fraud ring. People facing wire fraud charges, indictments, and potential 20-year sentences in a multi-billion-dollar money laundering operation.
These were not small accidental contributions. These were substantial checks coming from the core players of the network that was systematically bleeding federal programs dry. The source material calls this a political explosion, and for good reason. It links the organized crime operation directly to the political infrastructure that was meant to protect the state and its federal funds.
Scoffing, and the excuses were immediate and just transparently weak. It was a community outreach effort. Or, we return the donations once we learn the truth. But the damage was done the moment that check was cashed.
Of course.
When politicians were shaking hands and cashing checks, the fraudsters had the necessary political access and cover to operate their industrial-scale theft without fear of immediate state scrutiny.
The campaign finance reports provided material evidence that the political system was compromised from the top down. The money was the lubricant for the fraud. Whether the politicians were willfully complicit or simply, neglectfully accepting large suspicious funds without due diligence, the outcome is the same.
What's the outcome?
The money taken from the American people was directly used to purchase political influence and protection within the very state where the fraud was flourishing. This failure of political integrity and accountability is why the crisis reached such terrifying, unprecedented proportions.
And the subsequent media frenzy only amplified the problem. The narrative became less about the billions stolen and the children who never got the food, and more about questioning the motives of the federal crackdown, framing the criminal networks as victims, and ignoring the documented money trails linking back to national security risks.
That narrative control was crucial for the political entities hoping to survive the fallout. By framing it as identity politics, a targeted attack, it allowed leaders to continue deflecting the reality of the organized, deeply rooted financial crime. But the facts revealed by the coordinated federal surge, the armored vehicles rolling into the Twin Cities, the precision of the warrants, the tracking of the money from Maine to Minnesota and then overseas, it confirmed this was the largest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history.
A national web.
The web was national, the theft was strategic, and the consequences for American affordability and safety are undeniable.
So what's the final thought here?
Fraud on this scale is not a random criminal anomaly. It is the inevitable symptom of profound systemic and political failure. This crisis reveals a deep sickness within our decentralized aid infrastructure and, critically, within our political oversight mechanisms.
So it was bound to happen.
In a way, yes. The criminal networks were allowed to adapt, to flourish, and to exploit the system for years because the people in charge were either neutralized by political cowardice, or, far worse, actively protected by campaign donations linked directly to the fraud.
So what is the chilling final thought? What's the future consequence if this level of failure isn't addressed decisively and comprehensively?
Accountability is the only path forward. If the leaders who oversaw this collapse, those who were either asleep at the wheel or accepting checks from the fraudsters, if they are not thoroughly investigated and held responsible for the billions lost, the criminal networks will simply learn the lessons of this exposure. They'll adapt, they'll find new loopholes and new aid programs, and they will continue to operate. They'll continue to compromise our national safety and affordability under a new guise.
It'll just happen again.
The fundamental question of who answers for this unprecedented disaster and whether the political system is even capable of policing itself remains open.
That is the staggering reality we're facing. The theft was industrial, the politics were compromised, and the risk to your safety and your wallet is real and ongoing. The evidence is clear. But I want to know what you think. Who should answer for the billions lost? Should the leaders who allowed the systemic failure to happen face investigation and removal from office? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. We read every single one. I'm Alex.
And I'm Sophia. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.